Welcome to Pennsylvania in Focus. I'm Eliana Kernodle. Joining me today is the Center Square's Pennsylvania editor, Kristen Smith. How's it going, Kristen?
Good. How are you?
Doing well. This past weekend in Pennsylvania saw two different visions playing out. Kristen, what were Pennsylvania Republicans and Democrats up to?
Both groups in Pennsylvania were particularly concerned about the Department of Education. As we all know by now, Trump has signed an executive order to dismantle it. Republicans are overwhelmingly thrilled about this. They have believed that the Department of Education has been failing in their duty to help support public education in the country, and that it's become increasingly politicized over the last 10 years under Democratic control. And so that is something that they're celebrating, that this is coming to an end in their eyes, at least as long as Trump is president. It's important to note that of the Department of Education, there is a lot of it that they're talking about transferring to other agencies. There's also, it's important to note that a lot of the biggest protections, particularly for students with disabilities, those things are already protected by other laws. So dismantling the Department of Education is not exactly the way that it's been characterized by Democrats, quite frankly, and we'll get into that. That being said, Republicans they're continuing their victory laps. They are really celebrating their new party aligned under Trump. And that continued when they gathered this past weekend in Camp Hill to talk about that. Camp Hill is just across the river from the state capitol. And we had some heavy hitters there. Dave McCormick was there. The former White House press secretary was there. You had Scott Perry. You had social media influencers, particularly in the education space. So there was a lot of focus on this element. And there was a lot of, I hesitate to say immature, but there was a lot of feeling, and again, this victory lap and this echoing of Trump's style, where he's very casual and likes to make jokes. And, at one point there was a reference to little 5'3" Josh Shapiro. So they, like I said, they're definitely reveling in the fact that it seems that a majority of Americans for the first time are aligned with them, and that there's going to be real change that is going to restore their version of America. At the same time, you have Democrats who are crying out against the dismantling of the Department of Education. There was also organized protest at the state capitol this weekend that was talking about proposed cuts to other government programs, Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security benefits of that realm. Now, it's important to note again that the Trump administration has said that cuts that money that is given directly to people, say for food stamps, for medical insurance and coverage, that is not going to be impacted. But there are other programs and grants that will be, because they fund things that no longer align with the Trump administration's stated goals. But Democrats are saying this, as well as DEI, as well as dismantling the Department of Public Education, that this is really threatening the most vulnerable people among us, and it's threatening and punishing public school students. That is overwhelming concern, because Pennsylvania has a constitutional mandate that was upheld by the courts to right-size funding in public schools. We have a huge disparity in the amount of money that schools can spend on their students. This is driven by property taxes, and it's something that's been ongoing for decades. And generally what it means is areas with poor tax bases don't have enough money to support their students. And so the state has this new mandate to fix that. And I guess there's a lot of debate about exactly how we're going to do that. Democrats think we need to invest a lot more money. Republicans say we need to expand school choice and change our levels of our measures of accountability here to figure out what's the best way to spend money. And there's a lot of debate over that. But when it comes to bringing the Trump administration into how the state funds education, that's a lot more. The connection isn't as strong. We only get about 10 or 11% of education funding from the federal government. The vast majority comes from property taxes, and then about a third comes from the state government. So really fixing that adequacy gap has to come from within the state and not the Trump administration itself.
And Democrats were observing the anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination over the weekend, and that was sort of kind of an opportunity for them to reflect on these things.
Right. So going back to the DEI program cuts that the Trump administration has really prioritized. And again, the cuts to public education, there's a lot of reflecting on the civil rights movement and what Martin Luther King Jr. stood for and how these program cuts specifically impact minority communities. Even the choice, the Susquehanna River divides Harrisburg, the capital city, from Camp Hill, where Republicans were meeting last weekend. And what is important about that is that Camp Hill has a very affluent school district, has plenty of funding, is highly desirable, has good test scores. It's everything that on paper people would want and be a place they want to send their children. On the other hand, in Harrisburg, it's one of our lowest performing school districts. They lack a lot of funding, a lot of money. They have a lot of socioeconomic factors to deal with, as well as just finding the resources to educate their students. It's an area where school choice is both popular, but also difficult to implement because of state laws. So they both really highlight the divide that we have in our public school districts. And again, Martin Luther King Jr. is obviously a very emotional figure. We all know exactly who that is and where he stood. So invoking his perspective on how all of this is playing out under the Trump administration is from Democrats' perspective, is very poignant. It is worth reflecting on our history and how far we've come to make education adequate and equitable for all students, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of socioeconomic status. It's just the future of what that will look like in Pennsylvania, how much the Trump administration will impact that, and whether the state can find a way to balance that out through their new adequacy targets.
Well, Kristen, thank you for your insights on this story. You can read more on this story and other Pennsylvania news at thecentersquare.com/Pennsylvania.